we come now to our conclusion of the book of Jonah. And if you remember at the end of chapter 3, God had turned the hearts of the people of Nineveh. He had warned them of his wrath to come. His wrath was very real, and it was on its way, as it is for the lost world today. And he gave that warning because of his love, wanting to see them come to faith in him and be saved. And that's what happened. They believed him. They believed his message. They called on him, asking him for his mercy. And the inevitable thing happened. He gave his mercy. That is God's nature to do that. That was what he desired from the start when he was sending Jonah there. And so the chapter ended in Jonah 3 saying, when God saw their deeds, that they had turned from their wicked way, then God relented concerning the calamity which he had declared he would bring upon them, and he did not do it. Chapter 4 then begins. But it greatly displeased Jonah, and he became angry. He's angry at God's kindness and compassion for others. Oh, is that how we respond? In our flesh, it's going to be how we respond when God shows grace and mercy to our enemies. That's how we're going to feel when he does that. But so what we need is his Spirit to guide us and to give us his heart for the nations. It's all about having his heart if you want to have joy when God shows his mercy. We all enjoy, of course, his mercy for us. Of course we like that. But if God shows his mercy for those of us, those who are his enemies, and for those who are our enemies, that doesn't make us happy, and it didn't make Jonah happy. It says he was greatly displeased, and he became angry. So his emotions are overwhelmingly against the people of Nineveh, and against God now for being merciful toward them. That's a bad situation to be in. And he turns him into a sulker, and he turns him into someone whose only hope is that maybe, just maybe, God won't actually be merciful toward them. Maybe, just maybe, they won't be saved. And so he says, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go watch. I'm going to hope for the destruction to come that I had told them was coming, although I knew God would relent if they turned to him. And he goes and he says to the Lord in verse 2, he prayed to the Lord and said, please, Lord, was this not what I said while I was still in my own country? In other words, he's gone back to saying, I was right, wasn't I? When I ran from you, when I made you throw a storm at that boat, when I wound up in the belly of the whale, I was right, God. This is why I didn't want to do what you were calling me to do. Isn't this what I said what you were going to do when I was still in my own country? Therefore, in order to forestall this, I fled to Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God. Now, these words Jonah is speaking are so true, what's starting at this point, are so true and so good, and they speak of God so well that you can actually put them to music and sing them to God in church on Sunday morning as a high praise. But keep in mind, as Jonah's saying them, he doesn't mean them as a praise. He means them as a sharp criticism. He means them as like a teenage girl who's yelling, I hate you, and slamming the door so hard that the walls shake. Yeah, I've had lots of teenage girls in the house. So that image came to mind. That is really the way Jonah's acting toward God at this moment. That's the attitude in which he is saying these words that if you want to, you'll have a great praise song if you put these to music. He says, I knew that you are a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, and one who relents concerning calamity. He's angry at God, and he says the reason is because God, you are slow to get angry, not fast to get angry. You are so abundant in loving kindness that you give it to people, not just that don't deserve it, but to people that deserve very much the opposite. And you relent regarding calamity. You actually want to stay your own hand of judgment. You want your wrath to be pulled back so it isn't poured out. That's actually your desire, God. Your desire is actually not to punish severely, even those that deserve it. You don't desire the death of the wicked. You long for them to be saved. God indeed wants everyone in our world today to come to knowledge of his Son and be saved. It's the only thing that holds up his coming. He's coming, and he will judge the world in righteousness, and his wrath will be poured out, as he has said in his word. But what delays it right now is that he wants instead to save people who are about to face that wrath. He wants to save them, and he wants to use you and me, who know him already, to let them know. Jonah just got to let Nineveh know, and they would be saved. You know, he's in heaven with the people of Nineveh now. And I'm sure now he's glad for what happened. And I'm sure that they are glad for what happened. And if your enemies get saved, your flesh won't be happy with it now, but your spirit will rejoice in it forever. The Apostle Paul, he rejoices with people that he had put to death for the gospel in heaven today. And all is forgiven, and all is wonderful between them in their relationship, as all of them together glorify the risen Christ who saved us all. That's God's heart. And when we develop God's heart, that's how we wind up feeling, even toward our enemies. But that's not what Jonah felt at that moment. Verse 3, therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for death is better to me than life. You know, you take your eyes off the importance and goodness of God's grace and mercy, then you take your eyes off the goodness and greatness of God's life-giving qualities, and you start to realize, you start to wrongly think that life isn't what's good, death would be better. That's what is happening to Jonah there. The truth is, death is not what's good. Death is a great enemy to be conquered, and life is what's good. Choose life so that you and your children may live. That's what our attitude needs to be. But if we become against God's mercy, we become against life itself. And we wind up being against our own life and happiness. Jonah could be happy right now. He could be rejoicing that God just used him for the greatest mission outreach that had ever happened into the world up to that point, and perhaps still today the greatest one that's ever happened. An entire city coming to faith, a huge city at that, coming to faith from 3 days of preaching. I don't think that has happened anywhere else in world history that I know about. And Jonah could be rejoicing at that, rejoicing that God used him, thinking, Lord, even though I was unwilling, even though I was unworthy of the call, still you called me. Even though I failed you, still you brought me out of the pit and called me again, and you used me for this? What a great thing! That's how Jonah could have responded. He could have had happiness that was above all the pain that he had been feeling, but he doesn't. He decides instead to go for the pain, to go for the sadness. And God's trying to get him to see that in verse 4. The Lord said, "Do you have good reason to be angry?" If God's asking that question, it's because he's trying to help Jonah understand, no, you don't have good reason to be angry. But he voices it as a question because he's trying to help Jonah realize it. He could just make a statement, Jonah, you don't have a good reason to be angry at me. You should be glad. He could say it that way, but he doesn't. He's trying to get Jonah's heart to awaken and to see the reality for what it is. Because when we're angry at God, it's because we're not seeing reality for what it is. We're seeing circumstances, but we're misjudging the big picture. And he's trying to get Jonah to say that. So he asks him, do you have good reason to be angry? Think about this, Jonah. Think about it. Jonah doesn't want to think about it. Not with an open mind, at least. Verse 5, then Jonah went out from the city and sat east of it. There he made a shelter for himself and sat under it in the shade until he could see what would happen in the city. He's hoping against hope for destruction, for suffering to come upon Nineveh. That's what he wants. And he's kind of making a demand for that from God. He's kind of, maybe without words, but with his actions saying, Lord, I'm going to expect you to do what I say is right with this situation. I want you to go ahead and to destroy Nineveh. That's what I want out of this. And I'm going to sit here and watch, and I'm going to pout, and I'm going to complain, and I'm not going to delight in you. I'm only going to delight in something that makes me feel good if it does. And that's your wrath upon Nineveh. That's what I want to see. That's what I'm demanding. I'm going to wait until you do it. Well, if that's what you're waiting for God to not show mercy on those who turn to him in faith, you're going to be waiting a long time. Because that's not what happens when people turn to him and ask for mercy. So God's got to deal with Jonah now. Nineveh's on the right track now. God's original servant, Jonah, is not. So God's going to have to deal with him now. Verse 6, so the Lord God appointed a plant, and it grew up over Jonah to be a shade over his head to deliver him from his discomfort. And Jonah was extremely happy about the plant. See, it's really hot. It's horrible hot there. And he was suffering from it. Actually suffering from it, not just whining and complaining. This isn't a moment to tell Jonah, oh, come on, man up, you can handle it. This is a moment where Jonah's actually suffering. I have a friend who was a fighter pilot and still is a pilot, but he was in the military in his younger years and served some in the Middle East, and he talked about these east winds of the Middle East and how hot they really are. And he said, you know what it feels like when the hot oven, you got your hot oven, you're baking something in or cooking something in, and you pull that door open and whoosh, this intense, very uncomfortable heat just hits you in the face. He said it's like that there, except it's not a puff. It's there and it just stays. And you always feel that bad, and you wonder, how can I take this? This is terrible, this heat. That's what Jonah's going through at this moment. God causes a plant to miraculously grow quickly in order to comfort him right where Jonah is. And God gives Jonah comfort. Does Jonah deserve comfort right now? No. And when we're belly aching at God, complaining at him, we don't deserve to be comforted either. But just look at how merciful he is, that he's willing to do that for the moment, willing to comfort Jonah and give him a chance to come around. It doesn't bring Jonah around because Jonah's only happiness is in the plant, His only happiness is in the circumstance God does to make him happy. He doesn't come around and say, okay, God, you are good. Your mercy is good. I'm glad it endures forever. And I will glory in your name that you do that. I was wrong. Thank you for being merciful to me yet again. And thank you even for your mercy toward the nations. Because you were right, God. That would have been a good thing for Jonah to say in that situation. He doesn't, though. That he doesn't come around. And so God's going to continue having to deal with him. Verse 7, but God appointed a worm when dawn came the next day, and it attacked the plant, and it withered. God can appoint these different things. He had appointed Jonah to do his will. Jonah had the will to disobey. So God can then appoint storms, and he can appoint a great fish to swallow him and then carry him and then spit him out on dry land, and he can appoint a plant to rise up, and he can appoint a worm to get rid of that plant. All these different things God can do, and all of creation simply obeys the voice of its God. But we have to be persuaded. How amazing it is that God is so patient that he continues to deal with us even though we have to be persuaded to obey. The animals and the plants and the weather don't have to be persuaded to do what God says. He just says, and they do. And they do so without complaining. We like to complain. We have 2 cats, my daughter's cats, and one of them, he sees me like an alpha male, and he recognizes my authority, and I can tell him what to do, and if he understands what I want, he does it. He just obeys. But I can't tell him go pay my bills or go fix the broken appliance or something like that. I'm not saying he can just do anything. I am saying, though, if he knows what I want him to do, he's able to understand and do it. If he's on the table, I can say, get down, boy, and he gets down. Or I can just go, and he gets down. Or if I tell him go upstairs or downstairs or whatever, he'll go where I'm telling him to go. But sometimes he doesn't want to. Sometimes he might be up on a counter and there's food on the counter and he's trying to investigate and hoping to take some. And I say, get down, boy. And then he complains. He's just like, that's not what I want to do. And he goes, "Arr!" Makes a noise like that. But he still jumps down. He obeys because he doesn't view disobedience as an option. He might not like what he's doing, but he does it. If he understands that I'm telling him to do it, he does it. And we're not like that with God. We actually have to be persuaded to obey. And it's amazing that God is so merciful that he puts up with that. Because he doesn't deserve to have to put up with that. He deserves our obedience. He deserves our unquestioning obedience even, and he deserves having us do what he says immediately. And that's not what happens. Our heart can be, even as believers, even as his servants, like Jonah, our heart can be against what he wants in some area and wanting him to just give us our comfort, and we fail to be willingly obedient. Jonah was unwilling, he was unworthy, but called. And that relates to us in so many times, in so many situations, not the least of which in the same situation Jonah was in, where we have a call to have God's heart for the nations, and we in the church would be willing to do anything else but that. We would give money to the church to make the building more comfortable for us. But give money to the church so that it can support missions, so that peoples of the nations could come to know him. It's a lot harder to get churches to want to do that. And that's just because that's our nature. We want to provide for our own comfort. We want to provide for our own happiness. And the missionaries on the field, like Jonah, will feel like that too. They'll want their own, we'll want our own needs met. And sometimes that might even take more importance in our hearts than wanting to reach the lost. And God has to deal with us too. All of God's servants have a certain level of Jonah-ism in them. We are all unwilling in our flesh to answer God's call. And we are all unworthy of being given God's call. None of us has earned the opportunity to be an ambassador for the great high King of heaven. We don't earn that. But despite that, God wants to use us, and he takes imperfect missionaries like us and imperfect home churches like all of the home churches that are sending churches, and still calls us to the work and calls us to have his heart for the nations. And in the work that he's doing in all of our hearts, he brings that about eventually, like he did with Jonah. And he takes away Jonah's comfort now to make that happen. In order to get Jonah to be willing to obey and willing to be used of God in that way, God takes away his comfort. That plant that he gave him to make him comfortable in that horrid heat, now he rips it back away from Jonah. In verse 8, when the sun came up, God appointed a scorching east wind. The wind obeys, and he makes it hotter, and God on purpose makes Jonah uncomfortable. You know, there's little that makes me personally more uncomfortable than intense heat. And so sometimes, because of my own fleshly desires, I've actually given thanks to God for not calling me to a mission field in tropical places where it's always hot, because I just don't think I could handle that. I've had some people that would hate to have to handle the winters of Transylvania where I do live, but they don't bother me. The cold never bothered me anyway, so I don't actually have a worry with that. And I live in a place where the weather just happens to be what I would want it to be, and that's a blessing from God, because he doesn't owe me that comfort, but he has given it to me. And in this moment, God has to take Jonah's comfort away in order to realign his thinking. And he'll do that with you and me when he needs to. He's all wise. And he appoints a hot wind to make Jonah miserable. And the sun beat down on Jonah's head. You know, there's a level of heat that just makes your head hurt. And that it gets so bad that you would just take anything to cool your head, and that you reach the point where you're so overheated that that's the only thing that you would want is some cool air on your head or some cool water on your head. And that's where Jonah's is now. The sun is beating down on his head so that he became faint and begged with all his soul to die, saying, "Death is better to me than life." He despairs of his own life because of the discomfort, and he needs help with that. It's not a fake need that he's whining about here now. What God has done here to Jonah is put him in a situation where he really does need to be comforted and restored. He's fainting away from the heat, and God is allowing him to suffer in order to try to bring him around here. And it's not doing it, though. So Jonah says, not God help me, I will change my heart, but God kill me, because I don't want to change my ideas. I don't want to change how I believe about this. If I can't be comforted by the plant that you had given me initially, then I just want to die instead. It's better that I die than that I live, especially having to look down over Nineveh, which is now thriving because you've shown them your mercy. I can't handle it, God. Just let me die. God comes with another question. Then God said, this is verse 9, to Jonah, do you have good reason to be angry about the plant? And he said, I have good reason to be angry, even to death. This time he answers God. And he's pleading his case. We can so easily think I need to plead my case to God that he's the one that's wrong and I'm the one that's right. And we can be so convinced of that. We can actually believe it's true. That I'm the one that's right and God's the one that's wrong. Oh, how mock-worthy we are sometimes. I mean, just think of the times that has happened to you when you were convinced God's doing something wrong here, and I'm the one who's right about what should happen. And if it's been a distance of time, you'll look back and say, oh, okay, I'm glad God did it the way he did it instead of the way I was telling him to, because I can be so foolish and making my demands of God. He says, I do have good reason to be angry, even unto death. That's why I'm angry. Verse 10, then the Lord said, you had compassion on the plant for which you did not work, and which you did not cause to grow, which came up overnight and perished overnight. There's a kind of a silent comparison already being made in that statement. God's saying, Jonah, you care for a plant that was bringing you comfort. You actually care for it. You didn't grow it. It wasn't your doing. But while it flourished, you came to care for it. And then it died, and you didn't bring that about either. But you mourned and grieved for it. But Jonah, I used you to save Nineveh. And you don't care about Nineveh. I actually did use your work to bring that about. And it grew up and thrived. And you didn't rejoice. You didn't care for the people of Nineveh, even though you had a hand in bringing them about. That should have brought you comfort. That should have brought you joy. But you didn't care. And you wish that I would appoint my wrath to take them out as fast as I restored them through your preaching. Is that how you ought to feel about this, Jonah? Should you really care about a plant that you had nothing to do with just because it comforted you? When you don't care about the people of Nineveh? When you had a hand in saving them? Well, Jonah, I care more about Nineveh than I do about plants. And I want you to see that that's true. Verse 11. Should I not have compassion on Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 people who do not know the difference between their right hand and their left? That's a reference to children so young that they don't know which direction is which. They can't say right hand, left hand. They're that young. 120,000 kids that young. And God is saying, should I not have compassion on them? I do have compassion on them. Why don't you, Jonah? You walked through the city. You saw a large portion of that 120,000 children in this great city. And you didn't care? It didn't hurt your heart to pronounce that my wrath was coming upon them and that they were going to be destroyed? Really? It hurt my heart to think of destroying them. Shouldn't it have hurt yours, Jonah? Shouldn't it? And then he says, so he's saying, shouldn't I have had compassion on that? It had 120,000 persons that can't tell left from right, as well as many animals. Now, in our English Bible, that doesn't sound like a humorous joke. I'm told by the Hebrew scholars, the wording of it actually makes it seem that that's what God was doing, though. He was telling a joke to Jonah, and in the way that it reads in that dialect, it sounds like that, and it even comes across as funny in that dialect, and where God is saying, don't you want me to have compassion on all of those people and the animals? Again, that's not going to make you laugh, but God was speaking to Jonah's culture and his language in the way that he thought, and there's something of an implication there that God comforted Jonah there at the end by making him go, okay. And he was restored there. And that's how the book of Jonah ends, and how probably Jonah writing it caused it to end for perhaps that reason, where he was saying, okay, lighten up, fellow servant of the Lord. When things go bad, when you are down, but God still loves you and wants to use you for the salvation of the nations, lighten up and realize He is going to take care of us. He is going to still be merciful to us. We can call on Him when we need help and comfort, but don't get angry at Him when your comfort is delayed. Don't get angry at Him when your needs are something you're having to wait for because it's not coming yet. Keep your eyes on your purpose. And that's like a banner that Jonah puts up on the end of this book. Don't, fellow believer, don't let your needs take your eyes off your purpose. Yes, you have needs, like he needed comfort from that scorching east wind. Yes, we have needs, but those don't take precedence above our life purpose of knowing God and making Him known for the salvation of the nations. That's God's heart for the nations. If it is our heart too, then it aligns our thinking to His and puts us on the same page as God, so that we can do what He wants and He can use us for what He wants, and we can find joy in it even through times of trouble. Because sometimes serving the Lord to bring the gospel to the world is going to bring being cast down but not destroyed. And sometimes it's going to bring despairing even to the point of life and death. But God will be faithful through it all. And if we recognize what our purpose is, and that our purpose is to reach the Ninevehs and the Ninevites, more than our purpose is to take care of our comforts and needs of our own. When we get that thinking in line, it enables us to endure things that we wouldn't want to endure in order to be used of God. That's Jonah's final lesson for us in this. What are you facing? Perhaps, child of God, you've got a need that's not being met by God right now. Perhaps there's something you're actually needing Him to do and He's not doing it yet. And some bitterness against God Himself might be coming in there to where you don't want to serve Him if He doesn't handle this issue. Let that issue rest with Him. Be willing to wait. Be willing even to endure the pain in His strength, not your own. Your own won't be good enough. And tell God, I will still serve you. Even though He slay me, yet will I serve Him. And ask God to help you through. Ask Him to give you His heart for the nations. These things that Jonah needed to do and that we need to do, they only come by surrendering to His Spirit and letting Him live the life of Christ through us. We don't work it up in our flesh. We don't become more mature in the faith by trying harder. We don't become more in line with God's thinking by trying harder and buckling down and giving it all our effort. We become in line with his thinking by surrendering more of ourself, letting him have more control, and trusting him to do his work through us. That's where it comes from. The ability to go to a mission field or to prioritize supporting missions on the field above our own comforts in the land where God has placed us as our own. The ability to do that comes not from working it up, not from our efforts. The ability to do that and find joy in it comes from surrendering to God and saying, okay, all I have is yours, all I'll ever have is yours, all I'll ever need is yours to provide. And I'm going to trust you even when you see fit to make me endure through things that I don't want to have to go through. I'm still going to trust you even then. I'm going to let you live the life of Christ through me, Holy Spirit. I'm going to surrender to you. I'm going to let you be boss of my thoughts. I'm going to let you be in charge of my desires and my dreams and my hopes. I'm going to let you handle my fears and my worries. I'm going to let you wipe away my shame and regret. I'm going to let you do these things for me. And then the previously unwilling and unworthy and called one, well, I'll always be unworthy. But I can have the joy of being willing when I've surrendered these things to you. When my needs don't cover up my purpose and make me fail to see it. Thank you, Father, for opening Jonah's eyes to that. Thank you for using his story to open mine to it. Hope this study has been a blessing to all of you. And if it is, share it with others if you see fit. God bless you.